At my granddaughter's wedding, they handed me a name tag that said, "The Absent Old Lady." And for a moment, I almost believed it. I stood there at the check-in table, my gloved fingers resting lightly on the edge of polished marble, staring at the elegant script as if it might rearrange itself into something kinder if I waited long enough. The young woman behind the table smiled politely, unaware of what those words carried, or perhaps trained not to notice. I returned the smile, the kind I had practiced over decades of family gatherings, the kind that revealed nothing. At 68, I had learned that dignity often sounds like silence. I pinned the name tag to my pale blue dress, smoothing the fabric as though nothing had shifted beneath the surface, and walked into the ballroom. The chandeliers above shimmered like a constellation, casting warm golden light across rows of white linens and carefully arranged centerpieces. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of wedding I would have dreamed of for Chloe when she was a little girl, the same girl who once held my hand so tightly crossing the street that her fingers would turn pink. I paused near the entrance, taking it all in, letting the soft hum of string music and distant laughter wash over me. Everything looked perfect, and yet something felt slightly out of place, like a painting hung just a fraction crooked on the wall. Guests moved in clusters, champagne glasses catching the light as they toasted and laughed. But as I stepped further inside, I noticed how conversations shifted just slightly when I approached, how eyes flickered toward my name tag, and then away again. No one said anything. No one needed to. I made my way to the seating chart, scanning for my name, only to find it placed near the back, far from the family table, far from where I had imagined I would sit. I traced the printed letters once, then stepped back, as if distance might make it feel less deliberate. For years, I had told myself that families drifted naturally, that distance was part of life, that busy schedules and changing priorities explained the quiet spaces that had grown between us. But standing there, surrounded by silk dresses and tailored suits, I felt something else settle in, something quieter but sharper. It wasn't absence that defined me here. It was erasure. I adjusted the small brooch at my collar, the one my late husband had given me on our 40th anniversary, and continued walking, each step measured, steady. Across the room, I caught a glimpse of Chloe, radiant in white, laughing with her bridesmaids, her face glowing under the soft lights. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember the child she had been, the one who used to sit beside me at the kitchen table, swinging her legs and asking endless questions. Then she turned slightly, and I saw the distance in her eyes even from across the room, as if I were just another guest passing through. I said nothing. I simply took my seat, folded my hands in my lap, and waited, because if there was one thing I had learned over a lifetime, it was that the truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when people believe you are no longer paying attention. I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the soft clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation that seemed to flow around me without ever quite reaching me, as if I were seated behind an invisible wall that no one else could see, but everyone seemed to respect. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one, more for something to hold than to drink, the cool glass grounding me in a moment that felt increasingly unreal. Across the room, laughter rose and fell in gentle waves, but none of it felt connected to me. It was the kind of laughter that comes easily when no one is being watched too closely, when people feel comfortable enough to forget who might be listening. I noticed the way a few guests glanced in my direction, their eyes briefly settling on the small white card pinned to my dress before quickly shifting away, their smiles tightening just enough to suggest they had seen something they did not wish to acknowledge. I lifted the glass to my lips, but did not take a sip. Instead, I set it back down on the table with deliberate care. The place setting in front of me was immaculate, the silverware aligned perfectly, the napkin folded into a crisp, decorative shape, as though someone had taken great care to ensure everything looked exactly right. Everything except the person sitting there. I watched as Daniel moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting guests, shaking hands, his smile polished and confident. For a moment, I studied his face, searching for something familiar, something that belonged to the boy who used to run into my arms after school, eager to tell me about his day. But the man I saw now barely glanced in my direction, and when he did, it was with a nod so brief it could have been meant for anyone. Vanessa followed close behind him, her presence effortless and composed, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if guiding him through a performance they had rehearsed many times before. She laughed at something someone said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, bright and perfectly measured. I could not hear the words, but I could see the way her eyes flicked toward me for just a second, sharp and assessing, before she turned back to her audience. It was not hostility. It was something colder. Calculation, perhaps. I let my gaze drift away, unwilling to hold that moment any longer than necessary. At the head table, Chloe stood as someone adjusted the train of her dress, her expression radiant as she thanked a guest with a gentle tilt of her head. She looked exactly as she should on a day like this, surrounded by admiration, untouched by anything that might disturb the carefully arranged perfection of the evening. I remembered helping her pick out her first pair of school shoes, the way she had insisted on something with a small sparkle, something that would catch the light when she walked. She had always loved being seen. I wondered, not for the first time, when being seen had started to mean something different. A burst of laughter from a nearby table pulled my attention back, and I caught a fragment of conversation, just enough to settle something uneasy in my chest. Someone mentioned my name, followed by a quick, quiet chuckle, and then a voice, light and dismissive, saying something about how some people only show up when it suits them. The words were not loud, not meant for me, but they landed all the same. I did not turn. I did not react. I simply adjusted the edge of my sleeve and looked out across the room once more, taking in every detail with a calm I had learned to wear like armor. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a quiet conversation later. This was something built carefully, piece by piece, over time, and I had just begun to see its shape. I remained seated as the music shifted into something softer, the kind of melody that was meant to signal elegance and ease, yet all I could feel was the growing clarity settling quietly into place. It did not arrive as a sudden realization, but rather as a series of small confirmations, each one reinforcing what I had begun to suspect the moment I read those words pinned to my chest. A young couple approached the table beside mine, their voices low but not careful enough, and I caught my name again, this time followed by a remark that was almost playful in tone, as though they were repeating something they had been told earlier. "She is the one who was never around, right?" the woman said, and the man beside her gave a short laugh, the kind that signals agreement without needing explanation. I kept my gaze fixed on the centerpiece in front of me, a delicate arrangement of white roses and greenery, each petal perfectly placed, untouched by anything imperfect or out of line. It was strange how easily a story could be rewritten when enough people agreed not to question it. I thought back to the years I had spent showing up, quietly and consistently, the school recitals, the doctor appointments, the afternoons spent helping Chloe with her homework, while Daniel and Vanessa were too busy building their careers to notice how quickly time was passing. None of those moments had been grand or dramatic. They had been ordinary, the kind that rarely make it into stories told at weddings. And yet now, those same years had been reduced to something else entirely, something convenient, something that allowed them to reshape the narrative without resistance. I lifted my hand and adjusted the edge of the name tag once more, tracing the printed words with a calm that felt almost detached. Absent. It was a simple word, easy to accept on the surface, difficult to challenge without sounding defensive. That was the brilliance of it. Across the room, I noticed Vanessa speaking with a small group, her posture relaxed, her expression warm, but there was something in the way she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to create intimacy, that drew people closer. She was not just telling a story, she was building one. I watched as Chloe joined her, the two of them exchanging a glance that lasted no more than a second, but carried an understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. Then Chloe laughed, a light, effortless sound, and someone in the group responded with a comment that made them all smile in quiet agreement. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but I had spent a lifetime observing what was not being said as much as what was. Daniel approached them moments later, placing a hand on Chloe's shoulder, his expression proud, protective, completely at ease. Vanessa said something to him, and he nodded, his face shifting into a familiar expression, one I recognized from years ago when he was trying to avoid a difficult conversation. He did not look toward me. Not once. That, more than anything, settled it. This was not a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. This was a version of the truth they had chosen together, polished and presented until it felt real enough to share. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the quiet settle around me once more, and allowed myself to accept what had been placed so carefully in front of me. They had not forgotten me. They had rewritten me. And the difference between those two things was everything. I let the noise of the room fade into something distant as my thoughts moved quietly backward, not in a rush, but in a slow and deliberate sequence, as if each memory had been waiting for its turn to be reconsidered under a different light. It is a strange thing, how the past can feel so certain when you are living inside it, and yet so easily rearranged when someone else begins to tell it for you. I remembered the small kitchen in the old house, the one with the narrow windows that let in just enough morning light to warm the table where Chloe used to sit, her legs swinging back and forth as she struggled to finish her homework. Daniel would come home late. In those days, exhausted, distracted, always promising that things would settle down once work became less demanding. Vanessa would smile, polite and composed, thanking me for helping, always with that careful tone that never quite invited closeness, but never rejected it either. At the time, I told myself that this was simply who she was, reserved, focused, someone who valued order and independence. I respected that. I made room for it. I adjusted without ever asking whether I was slowly being moved out of place. There were afternoons when I stayed longer than planned because Chloe asked me to, her small voice insisting that I read one more chapter, help with one more assignment, stay just a little while longer until her parents returned. I never considered those moments significant. They were not grand gestures. They were not sacrifices I kept track of. They were simply part of loving someone, of showing up in ways that did not need to be acknowledged to matter. And yet now, sitting in that carefully arranged ballroom, I could see how easily those same moments could be erased, how silence over time could be mistaken for absence if no one chose to correct it. I thought about the holidays that had grown quieter in recent years, the invitations that arrived later and later, the conversations that became shorter, more functional, as if I were being gradually repositioned from the center of something to its outer edge. I had accepted it without question, believing that distance was a natural part of change, that families evolve in ways that do not always require explanation. But now, with everything laid out so plainly in front of me, I began to see that it had not been a gradual drift at all. It had been a careful shift, subtle enough to avoid confrontation, deliberate enough to achieve its purpose. Across the room, I watched Vanessa once more, the way she moved through the space with quiet confidence, her presence shaping the atmosphere without ever appearing forceful. She did not need to raise her voice or make bold declarations. She understood something far more effective, that influence often works best when it feels invisible, when it slips into conversations, into assumptions, into the spaces where no one thinks to question it. Chloe stood beside her, listening, nodding, absorbing, her expression open and trusting in a way that reminded me of the child she had once been, except now that trust was placed elsewhere. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something steadier, something clearer. Understanding. The kind that does not arrive with noise or urgency, but with a quiet certainty that settles in your chest and does not leave. I rested my hands once more in my lap, smoothing the fabric of my dress as if adjusting to a role I had not realized I was being asked to play. They had built a story about me, one that required my silence to remain intact. And for a long time, I had given them exactly that. But silence, I realized, does not always mean agreement. Sometimes, it is simply the moment before something changes. The music shifted again, signaling that the evening was moving forward exactly as planned, each moment unfolding with quiet precision, and I realized that whatever I chose to do next would not disrupt the rhythm they had created unless I allowed it to. I reached for the program card resting beside my plate, running my fingers along the thick paper, noting the careful details, the names printed in perfect alignment, the timeline of events mapped out down to the minute. Everything had been anticipated, arranged, controlled. Everything except me. I let out a slow breath and glanced once more across the room, this time not as an observer searching for meaning, but as someone beginning to see the structure behind what had been presented. It was then that I noticed a familiar figure standing near the far wall, partially removed from the main crowd, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed not on the celebration, but on the people within it. Howard Bennett had always had that way about him, a quiet awareness that missed very little. He had been our family attorney for years, a steady presence during moments that required clarity rather than emotion. When my husband passed, it was Howard who had handled everything with a calm that allowed me to remain standing when everything else felt uncertain. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave a small nod, not intrusive, not urgent, but deliberate enough that I understood it was not accidental. I rose from my seat slowly, smoothing my dress once more, and made my way toward him, each step measured, unhurried, as though I were simply taking a moment to stretch my legs. As I approached, he offered a polite smile, the kind one might give any guest, but there was something beneath it, something that acknowledged far more than appearances. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice even, "I was not sure you would come." I returned the smile with the same restraint I had carried all evening. "Neither was I," I replied, my tone calm, steady, revealing nothing more than necessary. For a moment, we stood in silence, the sounds of the celebration continuing around us, distant but constant. Then, without drawing attention, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed me a small, sealed envelope. The gesture was subtle, practiced, easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. I accepted it without hesitation, feeling the weight of it settle into my hand, heavier than its size would suggest. "I thought you should have this," he added, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond us. "Just in case tonight turned out differently than expected." I did not ask what he meant. I did not need to. Instead, I held the envelope for a moment before slipping it carefully into my handbag, the motion as natural as any other small adjustment I had made throughout the evening. "Thank you, Howard," I said, and this time, there was a slight shift in my voice, not enough to draw attention, but enough for him to recognize. He gave a brief nod in return, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharp with understanding. "Take your time," he said simply. "There is no rush." I turned back toward the room, toward the laughter, the music, the carefully constructed version of reality that had been placed around me like a stage set, and I felt something settle into place within me, not anger, not hurt, but something far more steady. Preparation. For the first time that evening, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was considering what would come next. And as I made my way back to my seat, the weight of the envelope resting quietly at my side, I understood that whatever story had been written about me was no longer the only one that mattered. I returned to my seat with the same measured pace, the same quiet composure, but everything felt slightly different now, as if the room itself had shifted just enough for me to see what had always been there. I did not reach for the envelope right away. Instead, I placed my handbag gently beside my chair and folded my hands once more, allowing the moment to settle before I chose to disturb it. Around me, the evening continued with effortless grace, waitstaff moving in synchronized patterns, guests leaning into conversations that seemed untouched by anything beyond their immediate circle. It was remarkable, I thought, how easily a person could become invisible in a room full of people who had already decided not to see them. A toast began at the head table, drawing the attention of the crowd, glasses lifting in unison as someone spoke warmly about love, about family, about the importance of those who had shaped the journey leading to this day. I listened carefully, not to the words themselves, but to what was left out. Names were mentioned, stories shared, moments recalled with laughter and affection. Mine was not among them. I did not react. I simply noted it, the way one might notice a detail in a painting that confirms what they already suspected about the artist's intention. When the applause followed, polite and steady, I allowed myself a small breath, not of disappointment, but of acknowledgement. The pattern was complete. I reached for my handbag then, opening it with deliberate calm, my fingers finding the envelope without hesitation. For a moment, I held it there, unseen beneath the table, feeling the weight of its contents, considering the timing, the consequences, the quiet shift it represented. Then, with the same steady motion I had carried all evening, I opened it. Inside were documents, neatly arranged, their edges crisp, their language precise. I scanned the first page, then the next, my eyes moving quickly, absorbing what had already been prepared long before tonight. It was all there, clearly outlined. The trust, the properties, the accounts, each one connected by a structure that placed control exactly where it had always belonged, though few seemed to remember it. My name appeared again and again, not as an afterthought, not as a formality, but as the central point around which everything else was organized. I closed the envelope slowly, slipping the papers back into place, my expression unchanged. There was no need for surprise. I had known, on some level, that things were not as simple as they had been presented, but seeing it laid out so plainly removed any remaining doubt. Across the room, I noticed Daniel raising his glass, preparing to speak, his posture confident, his voice soon to carry across the space with the authority of someone who believed he understood the ground beneath his feet. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand resting lightly at his back, her gaze sweeping briefly across the room before settling forward once more. Chloe stood between them, radiant and composed, the center of attention, the focus of every eye. I watched them quietly, the envelope now resting securely in my bag, its presence no longer a question, but an answer. I did not interrupt. I did not move. I simply waited, because timing, I had learned, was never about urgency. It was about certainty. And for the first time that evening, I knew exactly where I stood, even if no one else did. Daniel's voice carried smoothly across the room, confident and practiced, the kind of tone that draws people in without effort, and the conversations around us faded into a respectful quiet as I turned toward him. He spoke about love first, about commitment, about the journey that had brought everyone together in that carefully arranged space, and for a moment, it almost felt sincere, almost untouched by anything beneath the surface. He spoke about Chloe next, his daughter, his pride, his joy, recalling stories from her childhood that painted a picture of warmth and devotion, stories that were polished just enough to sound effortless. I listened closely, not because I expected to hear my name, but because I wanted to understand how far the narrative had been reshaped. Each word was placed with care, each memory selected with intention, and I could see how easily the past had been edited to fit the version of events they now chose to present. Vanessa stood beside him, her expression soft, her posture supportive, her presence reinforcing every word without ever interrupting. When Daniel paused, she stepped forward slightly, her voice lighter but no less controlled, adding her own reflections, her own carefully chosen details that filled in the spaces he had left open. Together, they created something seamless, something convincing, something that required no correction if no one chose to question it. Then, with a small gesture, Daniel raised his glass once more, signaling a shift, and his gaze moved across the room before settling, briefly, in my direction. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. And of course, he continued, his tone shifting just slightly, we all have people in our lives who, well, were not always present in the ways we might have hoped, but who still play a role in bringing us here today. A soft ripple of laughter followed, light and polite, the kind that allows a comment to pass without challenge. I did not move. I did not look away. I simply met his gaze with the same calm I had carried all evening, allowing the moment to settle between us without resistance. Chloe laughed gently, her hand brushing against Vanessa's arm, as though the remark were nothing more than a passing joke, something harmless, something not meant to linger. But it did linger. It settled into the room, into the quiet understanding shared by those who had already accepted the version of the story being told. I reached for my glass then, lifting it slowly, not to join the toast, but to give myself a moment, a pause that allowed everything to align. The envelope rested securely in my bag, its contents no longer abstract, no longer distant, but fully understood. Across the room, I noticed Howard again, his expression unchanged, his attention steady, as if he were simply waiting for something inevitable to unfold. I set the glass back down without taking a sip, my movements unhurried, deliberate. The applause rose once more, filling the space with a sense of completion, as though something important had just been affirmed. Daniel lowered his glass, smiling, satisfied, unaware of the quiet shift that had already begun. I adjusted the small pin at my collar, my fingers steady, my posture unchanged, and for the first time that evening, I felt no need to remain seated. Not yet. Not in response to what had been said, but because the moment they believed they had defined me had just revealed something far more useful. They had chosen to make their version of the truth public. And in doing so, they had given me exactly what I needed. I stood slowly, not abruptly enough to draw immediate attention, but with a quiet certainty that shifted something in the air around me, as though the room itself had begun to notice a change it could not yet define. The applause was still fading when I reached for my handbag, my fingers brushing against the envelope inside, a steady reminder of what I already knew. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I simply moved forward, step by measured step, toward the center of the room where Daniel and Vanessa stood beside Chloe, still surrounded by admiration, still wrapped in the comfort of a story they believed had already been accepted. A few heads turned as I approached, curiosity flickering in small, uncertain glances, but no one spoke. They did not expect interruption. They did not expect correction. That, I realized, was what made the moment so quiet. I stopped just short of the head table, my posture straight, my expression calm, and for a brief second, Daniel looked at me with something that resembled confusion, as though he could not quite place why I was there. I met his gaze without challenge, without accusation, simply holding it long enough for him to understand that this was not accidental. Then I reached into my bag and removed the envelope, placing it gently on the table in front of them. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it drew attention in a way that words never could. Conversation softened. A few guests leaned slightly closer, sensing that something had shifted beneath the surface. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice even, clear enough to carry, but never raised. The room stilled, not completely, but enough that the words settled where they needed to. Vanessa's smile remained in place, but I saw the subtle tightening at the corners, the brief pause before she responded, the calculation returning to her eyes. Daniel glanced down at the envelope, then back at me, his expression uncertain, as though he were trying to determine whether this was something to dismiss or something to control. Chloe stood very still, her earlier laughter replaced by a quiet watchfulness that had not been there before. I opened the envelope then, not hurried, not dramatic, simply deliberate, and removed the documents inside, holding them lightly between my fingers as I spoke. "It seems," I continued, "that over time, certain details have been forgotten." I let the words settle, not as an accusation, but as a correction, something factual, something difficult to argue against without drawing further attention. I placed the first document on the table, turning it slightly so that it faced them, the printed text clear, unmistakable, structured in a way that required no interpretation. I did not explain it. I did not need to. The language spoke for itself. I watched as Daniel's eyes moved across the page, his expression shifting in small, controlled increments, the confidence from moments before beginning to fracture at the edges. Vanessa leaned in slightly, her composure holding, but her focus sharpening, reading quickly, calculating faster. Chloe's gaze moved between them, then back to me, something uncertain settling into her features. Around us, the room had grown quieter, not entirely silent, but aware, attentive in a way that could not be undone. I did not raise my voice. I did not repeat myself. I simply placed another document beside the first, then another, each one reinforcing what had already been made clear. The structure they believed they controlled was not what it seemed. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer the one being defined by the room. I was the one defining it. For a moment, no one spoke, and in that quiet, the truth settled more heavily than any raised voice ever could. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, reading and rereading as if the words might change if he gave them enough time, but they did not. Vanessa straightened slightly, her composure returning in careful layers, though the ease she carried earlier had begun to thin, replaced by something more deliberate, more guarded. Chloe looked between them, her expression no longer radiant but uncertain, as if she were seeing something she had not expected to find. I did not rush to fill the silence. I allowed it to expand, to reach the edges of the room, to settle into the awareness of those who had gathered to celebrate something that now felt less certain than it had moments before. "Everything here is very clearly outlined," I said quietly, my voice steady, never rising above what was necessary. "There is no confusion about ownership, or control, or responsibility. I did not point to the pages. I did not need to. The structure spoke for itself, the signatures, the dates, the legal language that left no room for interpretation. I looked at Daniel then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that carried far more weight. Stories can change over time, I continued, but records do not. The words were simple, but they settled into the space between us with a finality that could not be softened. Around us, the room had grown still, guests watching quietly, their earlier laughter replaced by a careful attention that suggested they understood more than anyone had intended them to. Vanessa opened her mouth slightly, as if to respond, but then paused, her eyes returning to the documents, calculating, adjusting, reconsidering. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to reveal the shift that had taken place beneath his composed exterior. Chloe said nothing. She simply stood there, her gaze lingering on the pages, then lifting briefly to meet mine, something unspoken passing between us before she looked away again. I gathered the documents calmly, aligning them with the same care I had used when placing them down, and returned them to the envelope without haste. "I will not take up any more of your evening," I said, my tone unchanged, respectful, controlled. There was no need to say more. The correction had been made. The version of me that had been presented no longer held. I placed the envelope back into my bag, closing it with a soft, quiet click that seemed louder than it should have been in the silence that followed. Then I turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured grace I had carried from the moment I arrived. I did not look back. I did not wait for a response. I simply walked toward the exit, each step steady, unhurried, the soft sound of my heels against the polished floor marking the end of something that had been quietly unraveling for far longer than anyone in that room had realized. As I reached the doors, I paused just briefly, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge, if only to myself, the clarity that had finally settled in place. They had chosen to call me absent, to shape a story that required my silence to exist. But silence, I had learned, is not the same as disappearance. Sometimes, it is simply the space in which the truth waits to be heard. And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the light and the carefully arranged celebration, I understood that I had not lost anything that night. I had only taken back what had always been mine.